Hello, let's talk about writing effective midterm and term papers for Film 2009. So I'm just going to give you a broad overview about a bunch of stuff we have discussed in class and that you've read about in your textbooks. But for all the details and information, please be sure to consult the digital course pack and your textbooks, looking at movies and writing about movies for more information. So the midterm paper assignment is included in the digital course pack, so do be sure to read that, but I do have some highlights for you up on the screen here. So you're going to choose one film that we have watched or that we've discussed in class for your essay. Related to that film, you will select one prompt to focus on, and your options are to focus on the cinematography, the mise en scène, the movie classification, the acting, or a sound analysis. Your essay needs to be at least 1,000 words, written in a formal style, which I'll talk about more in a minute here, and have clear organization. And you'll want to make sure to use specific examples and some screenshots from the film to support your points. As far as your sources, you'll need to include at least one primary source, and that will be the film that you're writing about. So, for example, if you write about Juno, Juno will be your primary source. And then, in addition to that, you need at least two credible secondary sources. And you do want those sources to be really highly credible and maybe even scholarly. So, think about the research presentation that we had during class, and those slides are available on Brightspace if you need to review them. And you might also consider using that research guide, which is linked from our syllabus, it's linked from Brightspace, and it's linked from the digital course pack. That can be really helpful to find good sources. You will want to remember to use MLA style for your in-text citations and to include a works cited page for all of those sources. And you might consider using Noodle tools to help with your works cited page and also for your in-text citations. And lastly, you'll want to revise your essay before you submit it on Brightspace by the due date given in the course calendar. So do keep in mind that in the digital course pack, I'm looking at the assignment for the midterm paper here. We have a lot of information that's very helpful and a link to some helpful resources. So if you click on that helpful resources link, or maybe you can just use the menu over here to find it as well, if that's easier for you, you're going to find links to a bunch of helpful resources, places to get extra help, and also information about citing films in MLA style. So this information might be new to you if you haven't yet taken English 1001 and English 1002. So please notice that I give you links to some helpful resources like YouTube videos and websites about citing sources. I have links to Noodle tools here, and I also even provide you some sample works cited entries and some sample in-text citations. So again, if this whole idea of citing sources is new to you, it will probably be very helpful to consult the digital course pack and take a look at some of those links that I have shared with you. So this is in the digital course pack as well, but I'll just review with you really quickly some key elements of a midterm paper. So you're going to start with a research question that's clear and focused and open-ended. And you don't typically include this in the paper itself, but it's going to help guide your research. And we'll look at some examples later in the presentation. Of course, you will conduct research to sort of support your ideas. So you'll talk about your primary source, which is the film you're analyzing, and then you're going to use sources that inform that discussion to help support your ideas. So that might be journal articles about the movie or maybe about the director. You might find some books, you might find some reputable websites, but again, you'll need to be able to support your ideas. A really important element of a midterm paper is the analysis. So you're going to interpret your research and interpret your findings, using your evidence, using your examples from the film to sort of present an argument about the film. And typically that argument that you come to after doing your pre-writing and your research will be expressed in a thesis statement. So that's typically included in your introductory paragraph. It previews all your main ideas, and it often sort of answers the research question. You'll want to make sure that your ideas are well developed throughout your midterm paper. So a good rule of thumb you can use would be to use about 2 to 4 pieces of evidence from your primary and secondary sources in all of your paragraphs. And of course, you want those paragraphs arranged in a logical structure. So later we'll talk about outlining and I'll provide a sample outline to you in a related assignment. So I would definitely encourage you to use an outline before drafting just to help get your ideas sort of arranged. Again, like I've mentioned, it's so important to cite your sources in MLA style so that you can avoid plagiarism. And the paper typically is going to have an introduction and conclusion paragraph, so you want to include those. And as I mentioned before, you'll want to make sure that you revise your work before you submit it. So it's a good idea, maybe seek some feedback from somebody else in class, come visit me during office hours and we can chat about your paper, or you can certainly visit the Writing Center to help get some feedback to conduct an effective revision before you hand it in. You don't want to hand in your first draft. There are very few writers that can whip up one draft and hand it in and have it be satisfactory. In the next part of the presentation, I just want to review the chapters you've read so far in your Writing About Movies textbook. Again, I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the highlights. This is not all the information. This is not all the details from the book. So although you've read those chapters already, I'll encourage you to go back and review them because they have so much helpful information for you. Do keep in mind too, I'm going to give one more shout out to the illustrated glossary of film terms. It's at the very end of the textbook. It starts, let's see here, it's in part 3, starts on page 197, and that can be super, super helpful just for using some terminology when you're talking about the cinematic language of film. So chapter 1 in writing about movies discusses what are the challenges of writing about movies. And they offer you 4 elements to focus on when we're thinking critically about film that I think can be really useful in your midterm paper. So it's to summarize, evaluate, analyze, and synthesize as you're thinking about your film. So in that summary step, you're gonna, summarize elements of the film for your reader, but you want to be sure that summary is always in service of your argument or that you're giving necessary background information for the reader. You never want it to just be taking up space in your paper, and you want to be really careful not to make the common mistake of only summarizing a film in your paper. Summary is just the first step, but we must go beyond summary. So think about using summary to support your argument or to fill in any background information, to fill in the blanks for your reader, stuff they might not know. But that's not the only step. We have to push beyond summary into evaluation, analysis, and synthesis. So when we evaluate our sort of reaction to our film, we're going to articulate the reasons for your response. So if we say the film makes me feel XYZ, we're going to push beyond saying this is how I reacted to articulate the reasons for that response. And in the evaluation section, you might also consider comparing your film to other films that you've seen. So how does Juno compare to other films about teenagers that you've seen, or maybe other films by the same director, etc. Next, we'll be ready to analyze the film. So when we analyze anything, we basically break it down into the parts and think about how they constitute the whole. So with a film, we're going to break it down into those filmic elements, right? Like the scenes, the camera movements, the soundtrack, all those elements that we've been discussing. We're going to break down the parts, and then we're going to think about how they contribute to the meaning of the film or to the overall impression of the film. And then finally, in the synthesis section, we're going to make connections between our ideas. So we might think about the way the film made us feel, and then consider the parts of the film that made us feel that way. And then we're going to connect all those to a larger perspective about the film. So here's where we're making connections between our observations and then connecting those ideas to sources. And hopefully what happens at the end of this process is that we've created what we're calling an umbrella argument and sort of transforming a list of observations into something debatable, right? So we're not just noticing that a director uses a certain style of camera movement, but we're thinking more deeply then about how that relates maybe to the genre of the film or how it relates to what critics have said about the film. Again, all in service of creating a sort of argument, and not an argument in the sense of I'm right and you're wrong, but an argument in the sense of like a debatable stance about the movie. Chapter one also talks about some of the more writing-ish aspects of film. So you definitely want to think about your tone and style. And in the midterm paper, you'll want to use a formal tone. So just as a quick refresher, in case you haven't taken Comp 1 and Comp 2, formal tone involves overall being objective. So you want to focus on facts and evidence, not your personal opinions and not your emotions. So during the pre-writing phase, you might be thinking about how I feel about this film, what emotions it inspired in me. But we want to transform that into an objective discussion about the film. So instead of saying, I was afraid when I saw this scene, in the midterm paper, it might end up saying that the suspense makes audiences fearful, right? We're expressing that same idea, but we're not doing it from this kind of biased perspective. So you'll also want to just, sort of rely on clear and precise language. You want to stay away from slang. You want to stay away from overly casual wording. Think about writing in the third person perspective to obtain that neutral viewpoint. So typically in formal tone, we're going to advise you to stay away from first and second person, like pronouns like I and me and you and we, and stick to that sort of third person perspective. You'll probably find yourself using phrasing like the audience, the viewer, quite a bit when you're writing about films. So of course, you want to use complete sentences, you want to avoid contractions, you want to use, specific and vivid language and varied sentence structures. And lastly, you want to stay respectful and unbiased. So there might be some sensitive topics that come up when we discuss films, of course, and you just want to keep like a respectful tone in mind. Finally, please avoid AI generated language. Just a reminder that the use of AI is prohibited in this course. And AI language sounds really crappy. Maybe someday it will be better than student writing, but it is definitely not there yet. So I would so much rather read your thoughts, your writing, your voice, than something written by AI. Please keep that in mind. Okay, in chapter two, they discuss looking at movies. So some advice for you. Of course, you're going to want to rewatch the film that you're writing about, maybe even a couple times. And keep in mind that all the films we've watched in class are on reserve in Jacob's library. So if you're not able to find it for free online, or you can't obtain the DVD somewhere, you can always check it out from the library here at IVCC. And you'll want to take notes. So it can be overwhelming to try to take notes if you're not focused. So you might be looking for certain elements to take notes on. Maybe you're going to discuss the cinematography, so you're going to focus on the camera work. Or you might keep your eye out for elements that are like puzzling or unique or memorable, and just sort of consider why they stand out to you. In this sort of pre-thinking and pre-writing moment, it's also a good idea to analyze the plot, maybe segments of the plot, and then certain shots and sequences. So if you're going to make an argument about the cinematography, you're probably going to want to discuss specific shots and specific sequences in your paper that illustrate what you're talking about. So this director tends to use, XYZ type of camera movement, and then you break down a scene where that camera movement happens. And then you can look for examples of the cinematic language that support the main idea of your essay. So you've done your pre-writing, you think you have an argument about your film, watch it one more time and keep your eye out for those invisible elements and try to make them visible to your reader through your writing. Now, chapter 3 offers some advice about formal analysis, and we've discussed quite a bit of this in class. When we analyze formally, we're thinking about all these, complicated elements of a film, and how they act together. So separately, we might analyze the sound or the acting, right? But then in our overall argument, we're going to bring them back together in that synthesis. So when we formally analyze the film, we're often talking about the film's form. So the narrative, the mise en scène, the editing, all those elements that we've been discussing in class. Keep your eye out for those. You'll probably also want to consider the explicit meanings of the film and the implicit meanings of the film. So sort of overall, always thinking about how the form impacts the content and therefore the meaning of the film, But that meaning idea can be complicated because typically movies have two meanings, right? We have the explicit surface meaning, what's obvious to the viewer, what the movie shows you. And then we have the implicit meaning, like what's below the surface? What does that movie mean? And often it's up to the audience to sort of discover and dig in and find that meaning through associations, through inferences, through things like that. So, an example of a film we've all seen is The Wizard of Oz. And the surface meaning, the explicit meaning, is about a girl named Dorothy. She travels to a magical land and then she has to try to find her way home. And then she makes friends and faces challenges along the way. But the deeper meaning of that film is how it symbolizes this idea of personal growth and self-discovery, right? And this idea that what we're seeking externally often actually lies within ourselves. So as you analyze and argue about your film, you might be thinking about those two levels of meanings that it operates with. In chapter 4, writing about movies talks about cultural analysis. So, this is where we're thinking about that implicit meaning. It's usually expressed in the implicit meaning that sort of reflects the cultural assumptions of the culture that produced it. And we don't get too deeply into this in this class, but the chapter talks about how these, film cultural analysis is tightly related to critical perspectives from other subject areas. So, philosophers, social theorists, and cultural critics who examine, different elements through lenses like feminism, or they're studying things through a lens of queer theory, right? We can do the same thing with film. So we can examine films through critical lenses like the socioeconomic status. What does the film say about power structures in society? In society, what does the film say about gender, right? How is gender represented, and how are the power structures of gender represented? Lots of films discuss race and ethnicity and national origin, and that might be things about tension or, again, the structures of society or power imbalances. Another critical lens you'll see is sexual orientation, like how heteronormative is the film, or does it transgress that portrayal? And again, what are the power structures? One option is to study the genre of the film. So you might think about how the film fits or subverts the genre's expectations. So are the themes of the film typical of the genre, or do they vary from it? What about the setting? What about the presentation and the imagery that is presented? How does that fit with or maybe diverge from the typical film in its genre? You might think about historical analysis, like aesthetic approaches in auteurism. And we'll talk about auteurism more later in the semester. But basically, in this mode, we're evaluating a director's whole body of work based on their signature style. So we've talked about Wes Anderson's signature style, right? And there are certain directors where you know within a heartbeat that you're watching a film by so and so because of the way it looks, or the way it sounds, or the way it feels. So that's an aesthetic approach we could think about. We might think about technological approaches, economic approaches, film and social history approaches, all you might think of as just different lenses through which we're viewing the film. Finally, the last chapter you've read in Writing About Movies, chapter 5, gives you some ideas for generating ideas for an essay. So for a lot of students, the first step is the most difficult, like the how do I get started step. And I think this chapter gives you an really great, really thorough overview of different ways to get into the writing of your midterm paper. So you certainly don't have to do all of these, like these are not required, but I think they're definitely worth reading about because they give you some powerful, motivating steps to get started. So the first step is what we're doing in class, just conversing about the films. So, we've been talking about Donnie Darko, we've been talking about Juno. Maybe those conversations inspire a focus for your paper. You might do brainstorming, like you sit down with a piece of paper or with a Word document open in front of you and just kind of dump your ideas in a free writing type of way. Many students like to do what you might call a discovery draft or a rough draft. And it's important at this point in your process that you're not censoring yourself. You're just getting your ideas out and down on paper. And then we can always go back later and sift through that discovery draft for the gems, for the strongest ideas that we can take and develop into a full essay. A really standard sort of generating ideas approach is the five W's and the H. So you might have heard these called the journalist questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So if you apply those to a film, that can be a really simple and interesting way to get started. And finally, your book also introduces this idea of tagmemics, which is looking at a single object from three perspectives. And this actually comes from physics and like studying particles. But we can apply it to films too. So whatever film you choose, you might consider in this initial process looking at it from three different angles. And then finally, in your final draft, you will land on one angle that you look at it. So maybe at first you consider the cinematography, the history, and the critical reception. And then your final draft either focuses on one of those or ties all three of them together. Writing about movies also mentions this system of strategies for invention that come from Aristotle. They're called Aristotle's topoi, and they're just some ideas for invention. So if you read more deeply in your textbook, it talks about these in detail, but it just gives you ideas of like ways to consider whatever object it is under consideration. So you might consider defining it. You might compare it to other films or other authors. You might think about the relationships related to the films, right? Like, for example, the antecedents and consequences. What came before this film to inspire it? And then how did it impact later films or the discussion about the films? You might consider the circumstances surrounding the film. Or finally, you might consider testimony about the film, which in the case of our class would be the sources about the film. Finally, some questions to consider as you keep generating ideas for the midterm paper might be questions like who made the film? What's the production history of the film? What do the critics and scholars say about the film? What can you learn from the film's genre? Or does the work reflect an interesting cultural phenomenon? So you most likely won't consider all of these questions, but you might pick one or two to sort of inspire you in your writing process. So lastly here, I just wanted to review some helpful resources with you. Again, you have your textbooks looking at movies and writing about movies. I think they're super, super helpful, have a lot of great information. Now, you won't be using your textbooks as sources in the midterm paper, okay? You want to make sure that the sources that you cite and that you reference are discovered through your own research. So you don't need to cite them in your paper, but I would definitely encourage you to refer to them and to read back through them for all that good information they offer. The digital course pack offers a ton of helpful resources. There's a sample essay included in the digital course pack that might be helpful. It's on the film When Harry Met Sally. And it also includes a whole bunch of links that will be helpful for you. So do refer to the digital course pack for help. And of course, you're always welcome to visit the Writing Center, Jacob's Library, or my office hours for help. And we do have that specific library research guide available. Again, that's linked in the syllabus in the digital course pack and in Brightspace, so you should be able to find it. And that's a really good place to start with your research. So if you have any questions about the midterm paper, please do let me know. Otherwise, thanks for listening to the presentation, and please check Brightspace for an assignment that is related to this presentation. Thanks and have a good day.